Thank you so much for joining us. Just to let you know, we'll start the presentation in 1 minute. Thank you so much once again for joining us. Just to let you know, we'll start the presentation in about 30 seconds. An official hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. HazCom, Hazmat, HazWaste, and HazWoper, navigating OSHA, DOT, and EPA chemical compliance. Sponsored by J.J. Keller. This is Alan Ferguson. I'm an associate editor at Safety and Health and co-host of the On the Safe Side podcast, and I'll be moderating today's event. Once again, thank you for joining us. And before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council of the Magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session with our speakers. If you have a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and press the send button. We welcome your questions at any time during today's event. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. We might not get to every question, but the good news is unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. Also, after this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. And just to let you know, this webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event to view this webcast and all of our past webcasts. Please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events, or you may also receive a link in our post-event email. With that, let's introduce our presenters. With us today are Tricia Hodkovich and Michael Atkinson. Tricia has been an EHS editor at J.J. Keller for more than 25 years. She creates content for manuals, handbooks, videos, signs, training materials, online solutions, and webcast. Tricia edits publications for general industry and construction and specializes in OSHA and EPA subjects such as hazard communication, HazWoper, signs and labels, written safety plans, oil spill prevention, and bloodborne pathogens. Michael joined J.J. Keller in 2016, bringing with him more than 2 decades of experience in military logistics. His career spans a wide spectrum encompassing operations, management, hazmat preparation and inspection, logistics, and material handling. He supports the PHMSA hazmat regulations for highway, air, and water, and has extensive experience with international dangerous goods regulations. Tricia, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Alan, and welcome, everyone. Today's webcast is sponsored by J.J. Keller Consulting Services. At J.J. Keller, we're experts in OSHA, DOT, and EPA compliance, safety, and related best practices. With over 70 years in business and 70 plus regulatory specialists on our team, we're well equipped to help protect your company from an audit or inspection. And working with companies from coast to coast, our consultants offer significant value to businesses by identifying their risk areas, then delivering continuing oversight, training, and resources to help manage them more effectively. So, on behalf of today's sponsor, J.J. Keller Consulting, thanks for joining us today. Does your company manufacture, package, label, transport, store, use, dispose of, or treat chemicals? Chemicals play a vital role in the U.S. economy. However, some chemicals pose an environmental, health, and/or safety risk during their chemical life cycles. Whether you call them hazardous chemicals, hazardous materials, hazardous wastes, or hazardous substances, these chemicals are often regulated by OSHA, DOT, and/or EPA. In fact, the chemical standards listed on the slide remain some of the most confusing regulations covering millions of companies nationwide. And this webcast explores these 4 major stacks of regulations. It's important to note that states may be more stringent, so be sure to check your state laws and regulations to ensure compliance. So this webcast covers the federal regulations only. And now I'll hand things over to Mike.
Thank you, Tricia. So I want to welcome all of our attendees. Let's begin with the poll question so we can learn who's attending today. Which of the following chemical operations do you have? Do you manufacture, package, label, mark, ship, transport, or even store chemicals? Do you use chemicals or clean up spills? And do you dispose of or treat chemical waste? Click all of the options that apply to you, not just one. And we'll go over these results in just a few minutes here. Now, while EPA data shows there are almost 42,300 chemicals actively manufactured, processed, or imported in the US, OSHA data indicates those chemicals make up almost 1.4 million different chemical products. Under OSHA HazCom alone, the standard covers about 85,000 manufacturers and nearly 5 million non-manufacturers. So a lot of companies have a stake in chemical-related regulations, which can be a challenge for professionals who have to interpret or comply with not just one, but many of them. Hopefully today, we can give you a baseline to start untangling these regulations. So, all right. So thank you for all those that participated. Now, the results show, looks like we got about 78% of you that use chemicals or responding to spills. And then we got, looks like 69% storage, and then it goes down from there. So smaller percentages, of you guys are good, but that just means this webcast is really a great fit, and you should attend the entire hour if you can, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. But you can submit your questions now. So here are the parts of the chemical life cycle and which regulatory set might come into play for each chemical activity. For example, when storing chemicals, your facility needs to worry about OSHA HazCom because workers may be exposed to these chemicals in normal operations or a foreseeable emergency. If you are storing hazardous waste, maybe, then the EPA regulations would be a factor. And if your chemical storage area suffers an emergency response release, HazWoper would apply. However, simply storing chemicals does not mean DOT Hazmat comes into play. Depending on your chemical activity, you may have 2, 3, or even 4 regulatory sets to worry about at the same time. Over to you, Tricia.
All right, excellent, Mike. Thank you. So the Hazard Communication Standard, or HazCom standard, was written by OSHA to provide workers with information about the hazards of the chemicals they work with or near. The standard is found at 29 CFR 1910 at 1200 for general industry. It's also found in other CFRs for maritime, construction, and agriculture. Under the standard, employers have responsibilities to keep or help keep workers safe from hazardous chemicals, and we're going to cover these today. A chemical is any substance or mixture of substances, whereas a hazardous chemical is defined as any chemical which is classified as a physical or health hazard, a simple asphyxiant, combustible dust, or hazard not otherwise classified. And these terms are defined in the HazCom standard. The OSHA HazCom standard does not cover every hazardous chemical, so it pays to look over the exemptions listed at 1910 to 1200 B6, and we summarize some of them here, and the remainder of the exemptions are summarized here. But do look at the regulation for all the details on exemptions. So if you're a chemical manufacturer, importer, you're responsible for analyzing the hazardous chemicals you produce or ship and determine the hazards present in your product. Then the hazardous chemicals are classified or assigned to a hazard class as shown on the slide. And many hazardous chemicals fit into more than one class. Final rules in May and October this year updated the hazard classification. Each hazard class is further divided into hazard categories, which are usually identified by numbers based on the degree of severity. The lower the category number, the higher the severity within that class. As an example, the categories of flammable liquids include those listed on the slide. Now, after the manufacturer importer classifies all the hazards of a chemical, the information is used for generating safety data sheet and HazCom label.
Yeah, the safety data sheets, or SDS, explains what workers need to know to work safely with a specific chemical, from what it looks like and smells like to its potential hazards to what to do in the event of an incident. The slide lists 16 sections required for the SDS. Mandatory Appendix D of 1910.1200 lists not only the 16 sections, but the subsections under each one of these sections headers. Now, the required subsections changed with a final rule that was issued last May. That means employers will have to maintain any new SDSs they receive. And SDSs must be kept in your employee work areas where your employees can easily access them for as long as the corresponding chemicals are in use at your workplace. They're usually stored in binders or on a computer, but be sure your employees know where the SDSs are located and how to access them without any barriers. Now, each hazardous chemical container must be labeled with 6 elements before it can be shipped. These elements are listed here on the slide if you take a look. In certain situations, chemical containers must be relabeled. If used in-house, the chemical containers may have what they call workplace labels with at least the product identifier and hazard information. And alternative in-house labeling may need updating with new classifications by the compliance dates in the HazCom standard. Now remember that the label must have all 6 label elements listed on the previous slide if the container will be shipped. Situations where relabeling is permitted or required include if you choose to use a uniform workplace labeling system, or when you break down a large quantity into a smaller, more portable containers that are not for immediate use, or when labels are soiled, unreadable, or missing. Now, OSHA defines a container as any bag, barrel, bottle, box, or the like that contains a hazardous chemical. Things like pipes, engines, and fuel tanks are not considered to be containers for the purpose of HazCom. Any OSHA-defined container must have a HazCom label when shipped. However, if these HazCom labeled chemical containers are packaged with another container, an OSHA HazCom label is not required to appear on the outer container because the outer container would not contain a hazardous chemical. For instance, a box that contains several smaller containers of a hazardous chemical would not require an OSHA HazCom label on the box. However, each smaller container inside the box would require a HazCom label when shipped.
Thank you, Mike. So there are several labeling exemptions and loopholes in the HazCom standard, and we will not cover them today, but we listed the related subparagraphs so you can find them. Also, the ones in red are new with the final OSHA rule that published in May and the corrective rule that published in October. So do check out the details. We're just summarizing them here. So with some exceptions in paragraphs B, 3, 2, or 4, I'm sorry, 3, 4, or 6. Can I read? 3, 4, or 6. Employers must have and keep an updated written HazCom program. And so the written program documents your plans for communicating the hazards involved with chemicals. The written program must contain information about how you will address the criteria in the HazCom standard, like SDSs and labels, how you'll address worker training, a list of all hazardous chemicals on site, and the methods to inform workers of the hazards associated with non-routine tasks and unlabeled types. You must train workers who may be exposed to hazardous chemicals under normal operating conditions or in foreseeable emergencies. Information and training for each worker needs to cover the elements listed at 1910.1200 H and J. Training is required at the time a worker is assigned to work with any hazardous chemical, and whenever a new hazard, not necessarily a new chemical, a new hazard is introduced into the worker's work area. In multi-employer work sites, the employer is responsible for providing updated training when its workers are exposed to new hazards, even if these hazards are created by other employers. Refresher training is not required annually for HazCom, but providing training once and assuming years later workers are still knowledgeable is a risky assumption. Note that your worker training programs may need updates to accommodate the new classifications under the new rule. Training is required to be provided at no cost to workers, and workers must be paid for the time they spend at training. Your training program is a forum for explaining not only the hazards of the chemicals in the work area, but also how to use the information generated in the program. So this can be accomplished in many ways. Audio-visual, classroom instruction, interactive video, and online training are good examples. However, OSHA explains that workers must also have the opportunity to ask questions and receive timely responses. The training must be comprehensible, and here, to save time, we will skip over this slide on trade secrets, but provisions are in paragraph I and appendices D and E of 1910.1200. Now, we understand that developing a written HazCom program can be a real struggle. If you need help in this area, we can review and update your written HazCom program for you through our consulting services. Our unique model delivers ongoing support from an expert consultant working directly with you to assess your risks, develop a customized plan to mitigate those risks, and provide insights and resources to deliver the results you need. Now, if you would like to learn more about J.J. Keller's consulting services, use the poll to select your interest. And as a thank you, we'll send you our white paper, Hazardous Chemicals 101. And I don't want you to miss that. So while you make your selection, I'm going to take a question. This is actually a cool question. Kyle asks if HazCom and Hazmat labeling applies. Do shipping containers need both labels? Okay, this is a crossover. So let's say you have a bottle inside a box, and the bottle is the immediate container. It requires the OSHA HazCom shipping label. But the box, that's the outer container, and that requires the DOT hazmat label. A different scenario, let's say you're talking about a drum where there's no outer container, right? So then both the OSHA HazCom shipping label and the DOT hazmat label are required on that container. Now, the thing is, you can merge the two into one giant label. And also, another thought, where you have a required DOT hazmat pictogram, it's just the pictogram here that we're talking about, then the OSHA regulations say that the HazCom pictogram for the same hazard is not required. So, and that's just about the pictogram there, not the whole label. But that is one of the loopholes that I mentioned earlier. All right, Mike?
Awesome. Thank you, Tricia. So hazardous materials, or HazMat, is regulated by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is an agency within the Department of Transportation, or DOT. And really, to make it easy for you, we're just going to call it DOT. Now, hazardous materials regulations, or the HMR, are in 49 CFR parts 171 through 180. They are federal regulations aimed really to ensure that hazmat is packaged and handled safely during transport. Now, DOT defines hazmat as a substance or material the agency determines can pose an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property during transportation. And transportation really means the material is transported by highway, rail, air, or water. Now, your workers are considered hazmat employees if they directly affect hazmat transportation safety. And really this includes anyone that loads, unloads, or handles hazmat. Also, if they design, manufacture, fabricate, inspect, mark, maintain, recondition, repair, test a package, a container or packaging component that is represented as marked, certified, or sold in the use for transporting hazmat. And hazmat employees also prepare hazmat for transportation, are responsible for the safe transport of hazmat, or they operate a vehicle used to transport hazmat. Now, your hazmat employees must receive training, including the elements that we have listed here. Now, training must be completed before they can perform any tasks subject to the hazardous materials regulations on their own. However, hazmat employees can perform tasks prior to completing their training if they are supervised by another properly trained and knowledgeable hazmat employee. But their training must be completed within 90 days of employment or a change in job function. Now, it's really the shipper's responsibility to classify any hazmat being shipped. Now, we list the 9 hazmat classes here on the slide. Some classes of hazmat are also broken down into what they call divisions. But you want to be careful because DOT hazmat divisions really aren't the same as OSHA HazCom categories. And as a shipper, you'll use the hazmat table to pick a shipping description that best describes a hazardous material. So shipping papers are used to identify regulated hazmat being offered for transportation or transported. You may also hear terms like shipping order, bill of lading, waybill, or manifest. If an incident or accident occurs, the shipping papers provide not only information about what hazmat is on board, but also contains information about their hazards. For each hazmat, the information listed on the slide is required. Even the emergency response phone number and the shipper's certification must be provided.
Okay, so the HMR refers to packages as bulk, non-bulk. Common types of bulk packages and non-bulk packages are listed on the slide. If hazmat packages are damaged, defective, or leaking, you may place them into a salvage packaging for transport, for recovery, or disposal. Also, hazmat itself that has spilled or leaked from a package may be placed in a salvage packaging too. As a shipper of hazmat, you must determine the appropriate markings, labels, and placards that are required for each hazmat. Markings are required to be on outer packagings of hazmat. No package may be marked as hazmat unless it contains the identified material or its residue. So as shown on this slide, the regulations require markings to be durable, in English, printed on or fixed to the surface of a package or on a label, tag, or sign, displayed on a background of sharply contrasting color, not concealed or hidden, and located away from other markings like advertising or trademark. Hazmat labels are diamond shaped and 4 inches by 4 inches in size. Labels are used in conjunction with markings on non-bulk packaging and some bulk packaging to identify the hazmat within the package. The combination of colors, text, numbers, and symbols displayed on labels are specific to each hazard class or division. You must ensure the label is printed on or fixed to the outside surface, other than the bottom, of the package containing the hazmat. Hazmat placards, on the other hand, are diamond shaped and 10 by 10 inches in size. Generally, placards must be displayed on each side and each end of bulk packaging, freight containers, unit load device, a transport vehicle, or rail car. Attach or place placards in a placard holder and remove them if the hazard is no longer present. Just like labels, the colors, text, numbers, and symbols displayed on placards are specific to each hazard class or division. When loading and unloading hazmat, smoking on or near any vehicle while loading explosives, flammables, or oxidizers is forbidden. Be sure to take all precautions to prevent movement of the vehicle and attend cargo tanks when loading and unloading. Depending on the class or division of hazmat, you may need to shut off the engine or keep packages from getting wet. To prevent hazmat from reacting with other hazmat, the regulations also contain segregation requirements that indicate which hazmat may not be loaded, transported, or stored together.
Yeah, so unless there's an exception, like there is for most limited quantity materials, hazmat shipments that require shipping papers also require emergency response information to accompany your shipment. Now, the information on the slide, it must be provided for each hazardous material in your shipment. Now, DOT is flexible on how you provide emergency response information. So you can list it directly on the hazmat shipping papers. You can keep a copy of the emergency response guidebook or ERG with the shipping papers. You can keep a copy of the guide pages from the ERG with the shipping papers, or you can keep a copy of the materials safety data sheet with the shipping papers. However, for those last two methods, the basic description and the technical names must be included. And now note, the ERG started the 2024 ERG started shipping early this summer. So if you look at the URL on your screen, you can type that in and get some details about where you can get those. Now, some hazmat incidents require immediate reporting. The person in physical possession of a hazardous material must call the National Response Center within 12 hours if, as a direct result of hazmat, any of the incidents listed here occur during transportation. So if a person is killed, a person requires hospitalization due to injuries, and so on. Also, a written incident report is required for any unintentional hazmat release and for any incident requiring an immediate phone call to the National Response Center. So theft is a huge concern with hazardous materials. Workers, should help keep hazmat secure until it reaches its final destination. But there are some guidelines for maintaining a company's hazmat security. So, you should conduct security checks of personnel and vehicles, require ID cards or badges for access, maintain accurate and up-to-date hazmat inventories, make sure all hazmat storage areas are well lit, secure, and inspected regularly, should use locks, alarms, and surveillance cameras. You should use security guards and conduct security checks of all packages. Now, it's critical that your workers be continuously observant of their surroundings and the people working around them. And you want to note that any unusual behavior from anyone, for example, watch out for unauthorized persons trying to access equipment or restricted areas. Look out for anyone really appearing to be extremely nervous, agitated, or trying to hide something, and the list goes on. Have workers report suspicious behavior to their supervisors immediately.
All right, everybody, let's pose a self-test question. There's nothing to enter here. Just ask yourself, myth or fact. Certain offerers and transporters of hazmat are required to register with DOT and pay a registration fee. This is a fun self-test question. Certain offerers and transporters of hazmat are required to register with DOT and pay a registration fee. Myth or fact? Mike? What's our answer?
Well, Tricia, the correct answer is fact. This is an annual registration and fee that's due before July 1st of each year before engaging in activities requiring registration, whichever is later. And you can learn more at 49 CFR 107 subpart G.
All right. Excellent. So now we turn to HazWaste. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, regulates hazardous waste, or as we'll call it, HazWaste, under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. It follows a concept called from cradle to grave. It includes the generation, transportation, treatment, storage, and disposal of HazWaste. The federal regulations are found at 40 CFR parts 260 to 299, and our focus is on HazWaste generator requirements at 40 CFR 261 and 262. Anything you're still using or intend to use or sell is not a waste. Once you decide to dispose of it, it becomes waste. HazWaste is defined as waste with properties that make it dangerous or capable of having a harmful effect on human health and the environment. Under RCRA, hazardous wastes are specifically defined as solid waste that are listed as or that exhibit a characteristic of hazardous waste. As a waste generator, you must identify the waste you generate and determine if it is HazWaste. If you know you have a solid waste, you can check the federal regulation at 40 CFR 261.4 to see if it is excluded from the definition of solid waste. And if you have a solid waste that was not excluded, you may have a HazWaste. And then you can check for different lists in the RCRA regulations to see if it is listed as a HazWaste. And even if the waste does not appear on one of the HazWaste lists, it is considered hazardous if the waste possesses one of 4 characteristics: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity. Back to Mike.
Thank you, Tricia. So EPA's HazWaste regulations apply differently depending upon your generator category, which is determined by how much hazardous waste your facility generates each month. The more waste you generate, the more your facility is regulated. And you must count all hazardous waste you generate towards your monthly goals. And your monthly goals will determine your generator category. The regulations define really 3 distinct hazardous waste generator categories, and these include very small quantity generators, or VSQGs, small quantity generators, or SQGs, and large quantity generators, or LQGs. VSQGs generate the least amount of hazardous waste and are therefore the least regulated. In a calendar month, VSQGs may generate up to the amounts listed in the table per month. They have no accumulation time limit for shipping their waste off sites. Now, SQGs may generate the amounts listed in the table per month, and if you're an SQG, you must ship waste off-site within 180 days or roughly 6 months. However, if you need to ship the waste more than 200 miles because there's no nearby waste treatment, storage, or disposal facilities, then you have up to 270 days to ship it. LQGs don't have a limit on the amount of hazardous waste accumulated on site, but they are required to ship their waste off-site within 90 days. Now, say you're a waste generator and determined by your generator category. The next step is to notify EPA and the state and obtain an EPA identification number. Federally, VSQGs don't need an EPA ID number. This number is used as part of a national database to track hazardous waste activities. With some exceptions, small quantity generators are required to re-notify EPA or their state environmental agency as to their generator status every 4 years. And The next re-notification is due by September 1st of 2025. So if you're a VSQG, you don't have a regulatory requirements for training, but it is a best practice to train workers to handle waste safely. Now, if you're an SQG, ensure that all workers are thoroughly familiar with proper waste handling and emergency procedures relevant to their responsibilities during normal facility operations and emergencies. LQGs have more requirements around training for personnel. LQG requirements are found in 262.17 paragraph A7. If you're already providing this type of training to workers under OSHA's HazWoper standard, the EPA says your OSHA training will cover your LQG personnel emergency response training requirements.
Okay, so for management requirements, again, VSQGs have minimal requirements, while LQGs are highly regulated. So there's a spectrum here. The management requirements for HazWaste are lengthy, but when you boil them down, you can boil them to labeling and marking containers so that workers and emergency personnel know what's in them, and carefully storing waste to avoid releases to the environment. So generators have two types of areas that can be used for storing HazWaste. A central accumulation area, or CAA, is an area where a HazWaste generator collects marked and dated as waste. Waste in a CAA may only be accumulated for 90 days if you're an LQG, or 180 days if you're an SQG, or 270 days if being shipped more than 200 miles away for an SQG. And waste should be accumulated in a secure area. If you have a process where waste accumulates slowly, you can take advantage of a satellite accumulation area, or SAA. An SAA allows you to accumulate the amounts listed here in containers at or near the point of generation where waste initially accumulates. So the slide here offers you some safety tips for managing HazWaste containers. Use a funnel or hose to transfer waste to drums. Transfer waste to a new container if you notice a container is leaking or in poor condition. Keep containers dry and cool. Clearly mark container storage areas, and the list goes on. You may want to save this slide as reference. HazWaste containers must be labeled correctly with a hazardous waste accumulation label that includes the words hazardous waste and also the hazards of the waste. There's no time limit for an SAA, but once you reach the 55-gallon limit, you must mark the excess with the start date, the date you began accumulating the excess waste, and either begin complying with CAA regulations for your generator category, move the excess to a CAA, or ship the waste off-site within 3 days. Now, you must also mark the date the waste reaches the CAA on the container as the accumulation start date. So in reality, this gives LQGs up to 93 days and SQGs up to 183 days to ship the waste off-site. I don't know what color to call it. The orangish colored box here lists several ways to indicate the hazards of the waste on the label. So you have a lot of options. So finally, containers must also be kept in good condition, closed except when adding or removing waste, inspected weekly, compatible with the waste being stored in them, and free of residue that might or could react with any new waste being added.
Thank you, Tricia. Now, hazardous waste is a subset of DOT hazmat. So to comply with EPA's regulations, the generator needs to properly package, label, and mark all hazardous waste shipments and placard the vehicles used for shipping the waste according to the DOT's hazardous materials regulations. When properly marking each package of HazWaste for transport, the marking must use the words we show in that green box right there. Now, in general, federal EPA does not require very small quantity generators to use the hazardous waste manifest, but many transporters and some states will not accept the waste without it. So if you're an SQG or an LQG, you must prepare and sign the Uniform Hazardous Waste Manifest before shipping waste off-site. The manifest form, the fields in that form, I guess, are changing effective January 22nd, 2025, and the manifest will be a 4-copy form instead of a 5-copy form. Now, the manifest system the manifest system allows you to verify that your waste has been properly delivered. Now, starting January 22nd, small quantity generators and large quantity generators must register with EPA's electronic manifest system to obtain signed and dated copies of completed manifests. And as we said, EPA has hazardous waste e-manifest system. So generators, transporters, and receiving facilities have the option to create and submit manifests electronically. Currently, generators who are not registered in e-manifest may continue to use paper manifests, but starting January 22nd, your small quantity generators and large quantity generators must register to obtain completed manifests. Now, you need to be aware that the federal EPA hopes to sunset all paper manifests for everyone by fiscal year 2027. Now, a memo from late 2023 also says EPA-led cleanups must, and I stress must, use e-manifests now. So you can recycle hazardous waste, but let's focus on land disposal restrictions, or LDRs. Those standards require waste to be treated to reduce the hazardous constituents to levels set by the EPA or treated using specific technology. Hazardous waste generators must ensure their waste is treated correctly to meet the LDR standards before it's disposed. Now, your SQGs and your LQGs are allowed to treat their waste without a permit. Most generators, though, use the services of a waste disposal company or treatment, storage, and disposal facility, or TSDF, for help with their treatment options. Disposal is considered when hazardous waste is discharged, deposited, injected, dumped, spilled, leaked, or placed into or on land or water. To dispose of hazardous waste intentionally, you will need a permit or otherwise to be authorized to do so. Most generators really, however, simply send their hazardous waste to permitted or authorized TSDFs. So here's another self-test your knowledge. And so ask yourself, HazWoper is only about HazWaste. Do you think this is a myth or a fact? Again, your question is, HazWoper is only about HazWaste. Is that a myth or a fact? Tricia, what do you think is the answer?
Mike, the answer is myth. HazWoper is about hazardous substances, which we'll learn in our next segment on HazWoper. Okay, so the hazardous waste operations and emergency response, or HazWoper standards, apply to general and construction industries and certain state and local employers. Although much of the standards apply to waste cleanup operations, some portions of the standards apply to HazWaste treatment, storage, and disposal, while still other portions apply to relatively small spills or releases of hazardous substances at industrial or construction sites. The standards emphasize protection from hazardous substances, and this term includes any substance designated or listed as an EPA HazWaste, DOT Hazmat, biological agent, and substance regulated under an EPA law called the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA. Looking at the structure of 1910.120 and 1926.65, which are very similar, OSHA divided the requirements based on the type of operation or operations you have. And when you say HazWaste cleanup operation, we're talking about things like cleanup operations required by the government at an uncontrolled HazWaste site, RCRA corrective actions involving cleanup operations, and voluntary cleanup operations at sites recognized by the government as uncontrolled HazWaste sites. Notice that VSQGs, SQGs, and LQGs may follow either paragraphs P8 or Q. Also, emergency response is not just about HazWaste, but about hazardous substances. HazWaste cleanup operations deal with the waste by removing, containing, incinerating, neutralizing, stabilizing, clearing, processing, and/or handling it. And paragraphs B through O require employers to protect HazWaste cleanup workers during cleanup operations and help them handle the waste safely and effectively. So paragraph B requires you to have a written safety and health program before any work can be performed. During site characterization under paragraph C, the idea is to get as much information as possible about all the hazards that are present. Under D, some of the elements of a site control program include preparing a site map, setting up work zones, communications, and site security. And then the big one that we get a lot of questions, all the training requirements for cleanup personnel. These are the waste sites, though, cleanup sites. The training is listed at paragraph E of the HazWoper standard. Skipping to paragraph L, that goes over the requirements for emergency response involving the uncontrollable release of HazWaste and other hazardous substances. All right, TSD. So HazWaste treatment, storage, and or disposal, or TSD facilities, tend to be fixed ongoing operations. They receive, process, store, treat, and or dispose of HazWaste or hazardous substances from outside sources. Employers conducting operations at TSD facilities must provide and implement the programs listed in paragraph P, listed here. The TSD facility must develop and implement a training program for workers exposed to health hazards or hazardous substances at TSD operations. The standard requires that a TSD facility also develop and implement a written emergency response plan, or ERP, in accordance with subparagraph P8, and that's to handle possible emergencies at the facility. And this ERP is required unless the facility chooses to evacuate all workers during the emergency instead. If that evacuation loophole is taken, the TSD must have an emergency action plan, totally different plan instead. Here's a big however. So you may want to listen to this. Now, the employer who does not or cannot take the P8 loophole has the option to comply with either P8 or Q for any emergency response operations conducted in the HazWaste TSD area. Okay, because SQGs and LQGs must provide an emergency coordinator and perform emergency response, part of those HazWaste requirements, it means that these two generator types cannot take the P8 evacuation loophole. They must meet all of subparagraph P8 or Q. VSQGs fall under P8, but here's an interesting thing. For VSQGs, because they're not required to engage in emergency response, they can choose to alternatively take the evacuation loophole. Okay, back to Mike.
Awesome, thank you. So, emergency response operations for releases of or substantial threats of releases of hazardous substances must comply with paragraph Q. An emergency response is a response effort by workers from outside the immediate release area or by other designated responders to an occurrence which results or is likely to result in an uncontrolled release of a hazardous substance. Emergency response does not include responses to incidental releases of hazardous substances where the substance can be absorbed, neutralized, or otherwise controlled at the time of release by workers in the immediate release area or by maintenance personnel. It also does not include releases where there is no potential safety or health hazard. Now, take a look at appendices A and B of OSHA Directive CPL 02-02-073 to find out what's considered an emergency response situation and what's just an incidental release. Now, employers with emergency response operations for releases of or substantial threats of releases of hazardous substances that are not otherwise covered as a hazardous waste cleanup site, TSD, VSQG, SQG, or LQG must only comply with paragraph Q. We list the elements for paragraph Q here. Now, an ERP is not required by paragraph Q if employers elect to develop an emergency action plan or EAP and evacuate all workers in the case of emergency release. Now, OSHA does require emergency response training if workers are expected to assist in the handling of an actual or potentially uncontrolled release of a hazardous substance. Upon completion of the emergency response where there's no immediate threat of release, if it's necessary to remove contaminated materials from the site of the incident, the employer conducting the cleanup and decontamination must comply with post-emergency response operation requirements, but the employer has two choices for compliance depending on whether only plant employees are doing the cleanup. Now, we thought it might be handy to see a table showing you all the HazWoper training requirements. You may wish to keep this table for reference. For each operation, there are different trainee types and different training requirements. So this is something handy to have. All right, so here we have it. The slide shows you what we covered today in short, sweet, and to the point. So Tricia, off to you.
All right, so before we move on to our Q&A session, really, I'd like to once again mention the sponsor of today's event, J.J. Keller Consulting Services. Our services are based on a proven management methodology that creates effective controls for your organization, helping you achieve that best-in-class safety and compliance. So if you are interested in learning more about J.J. Keller Consulting Services, let us know by selecting your interest on the poll. And as a thank you, we'll email you our white paper, Hazardous Chemicals 101. Great one. Don't miss that. So now I think we're ready to take your questions. Alan, back to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this wonderful presentation. Before we start the Q&A, we want to remind everyone of the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar, and your input is important because it does help us improve our future webcast. And yeah, let's get to some questions. This one's for Michael. Do my warehouse employees need to have HM 181 training?
That's actually a good question. So what HM 181 is, that HM 181 is essentially the federal rule that input the hazardous materials regulations training for DOT. And so what you need to know is that's just the rule. That's not the requirement. The requirement falls under regulation 49 CFR 172.704. That gives you what you need to be trained on. And as we discussed earlier in the webcast, you're required to have DOT hazmat training if you're considered a hazmat employee. And that's anybody that deals with the transportation or safe transport of any hazardous material that's regulated by DOT. So if your employees move hazardous materials in the warehouse For shipment, they can be considered a hazmat employee. If you just have a driver that delivers the regulated hazmat, they would be considered a hazmat employee as well. So anything that we mentioned earlier on, or if they meet the definition of a hazmat employee, they are required to have DOT hazmat training.
This next
Great
question, I'm sorry. This
You're good.
next question is for Tricia. I work for a warehouse company that stores some hazmat items and pallets, but never interacts or uses those products. What training do I need to give my employees?
Okay. This is a great question, actually popular question with warehouses, retail, and all those work operations where employees only handle chemicals in sealed containers. So take a look. We're talking HazCom here on 1910.1200. I'm looking at the reg. Scroll down to paragraph B as in boy, number 4, and you'll see that it's kind of pared down version of HazCom for you. Kind of some loopholes here. There are some loopholes for the SDSs and labels. Take a look at that. But we're asking about training here. So under B4 it says that you need to ensure that the employees are provided with information and training accordance with paragraph H, the training requirement. With the exception of the location and availability of the written program, because where these operations with sealed containers don't require the written program. But the training and information is only to the extent necessary to protect them in the event of a spill or leak of a hazardous chemical from a sealed container. So it's kind of a pared down version, only to the extent where they would be to need protection there in the event of a spill or leak. So take a look, paragraph B4.
Next question is for Michael. What are common ways companies, specifically those with fixed facilities, are meeting in-route security requirements?
So in-route security is the transportation of hazardous materials, and what are you doing to protect those hazardous materials for theft, right? Or someone stealing them for various nefarious purposes. Now, what a lot of companies do is they lock, if you have a van trailer, for example, which is an enclosed trailer, they use locks and seals on their trailers so that they can identify if it's been broken into and whatnot. A lot of companies also go to pre-designated stops in different areas if they have to get fuel or whatnot, and these are generally well-lit areas that are heavily traveled, so the likelihood of being carjacked, for instance, is at a low threat. And what they also do is, and not everybody has this capability, but to reduce stops, if they're a shorter haul company, they take multiple drivers. So you have your driver and then you have your backup driver, so that they can essentially take less stops. They can just swap drivers to drive to the next location instead of stopping for rest breaks and that sort of thing.
Next question is for Tricia. Does at least one person need to be HazWoper trained regardless of generator status?
Okay, so when you say generator status, I'm thinking HazWaste generators. Remember, we talked about VSQGs, SQGs, and LQGs. And so you're asking about training. And when you say HazWaste generator and HazWoper, then I'm thinking we're looking at P8 again. The P8 rule requirements are about emergency response. And there's a loophole there for evacuating. If you decide that you're going to evacuate all your workers in an emergency response situation, then you create an emergency action plan. Then you do not have to go the route of the emergency response plan. You don't have to follow P8. But so you have a choice as a VSQG to either go with emergency response plan and have that training under P8, or Q in lieu of P8. Okay. Or if you evacuate, you're creating emergency action plan under 1910.38. I'm sorry. Yes, 1910.38, the emergency action plan. That has some training under the emergency action plan. But the other generators, as we mentioned, the SQGs and LQGs, don't have the same loophole. They're going to follow P8. or follow Q in lieu of P8. I hope that makes sense. We did have some slides on that.
We're going to try to ask a couple more questions. I know we're coming close to time here, but we've gotten a number of questions, so we'd like to get as many in as we can. This one's from Michael. If purchasing receives hazardous chemicals but doesn't open them but delivers them to lab managers, does purchasing need DOT training or just the lab managers that receive and open the packages?
So that's a tricky question to answer. So if it's within transportation, say this stuff got delivered to the location and they're just taking it within the building, they would not need DOT hazmat training. However, if they had to load this lab equipment and stuff into a vehicle and take it, say, across campus on public roads to deliver it to the lab technicians and whatnot, then they would need DOT hazmat training. So if you're transporting this on any road, any public road, it's required to have that DOT hazmat training.
Okay, we have time for one more question. This one's for Tricia. What's required of hospital staff who may clean up small spills of chemicals?
Okay, so hospitals, they're under the general industry regulations, 1910. And when you're talking spills, we talked about HazWoper today for emergency response releases. If the spill qualifies as an emergency response, it falls under that definition, then you're faced with an emergency response situation. And if you in hospitals, kind of hard to evacuate everyone, but so if you had the option to evacuate everyone in general industry there and do an emergency action plan instead, but let's say they're handling this emergency response spill, they need that HazWoper training under paragraph Q. But this attendee said, quote, small spills, right? And we did say that the size of the spill is not the only factor. Really, it's this bigger, broader, squishy definition of emergency response. But let's say the spill does not qualify as an emergency response release. It's considered what you would say an incidental spill. If it's an incidental spill, it does not fall under HazWoper. That's a big loophole there. But spills are not without hazards. And so these workers who clean up incidental spills may need other OSHA training, such as under HazCom, which we talked about first today, and possibly PPE or personal protective equipment training. And so if you're wondering, what do I have, emergency response or incidental spill, I love to point folks to a directive, and we did have this directive, a CPL on one of the slides, CPL 02-02-073 has two appendices, A and B, that go over the difference between emergency response and incidental spills, and which one, and some of those gray areas. But so lots of training possibly for these workers under HazCom, possibly PPE training. And then if it's emergency response, you may have HazWoper paragraph Q, I think probably number 6 if you're dealing with emergency response. Or if you evacuate, that's 1910.38, some training under emergency action plan. Wow, complex question, but great one. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time today. I'd like again to thank our awesome presenters, Tricia Hodkovich, Michael Atkinson, the entire team from our sponsor, JJ Keller, and of course, all of you who joined us today. Take care and have a safe day.